Here is something that happened today that almost everyone is looking at, but almost nobody is actually understanding. Iran refused to travel to Pakistan for the next round of talks. The ceasefire is approaching its deadline. American officials still boarded the plane and showed up anyway. And China said nothing. No statement from Wang Yi, no reaction to a Chinese origin vessel being seized at sea, no pressure on Tehran to return to negotiations, just silence. At first glance, that silence looks like hesitation. It looks like China stepping back, avoiding risk, waiting to see how events unfold. But that interpretation is too simple, because in international politics, silence is never neutral. Silence is a decision, and more importantly, it is a signal. The question is not whether China noticed what happened. Of course it did. The real question is why it chose not to respond. Because while the world is focused on Iran's refusal, something far more important is happening beneath the surface. Iran is not the only actor making a move right now. China is too, just not in a way that is obvious. And if you miss that, you miss the entire structure of what is unfolding. So let's step back for a moment and look at Iran, because the way this situation is being framed right now is fundamentally misleading. Most coverage treats Iran's refusal as stubbornness, as bad faith, as a country trying to run out the clock on a fragile ceasefire. But that framing ignores the logic behind the decision. Iran is not simply refusing, Iran is reacting to a pattern that has repeated itself more than once. The United States signed the JCPOA, then withdrew. Negotiations advanced again, then stalled. Agreements moved close to completion, then the terms shifted. And just days before another round of talks, a vessel linked to Chinese supply networks heading toward Iran was intercepted and seized. From Tehran's perspective, this is not a stable negotiating environment. It is a system defined by leverage. And once credibility begins to break inside that system, every negotiation becomes a calculated risk rather than a reliable pathway forward. But this is where the situation becomes more complex and where most analysis stops too early. The Iran you are watching right now is not one unified decision-making structure. It is two. There is the Iran that wants to negotiate, that understands the economic pressure, that sees the cost of escalation increasing with every passing day. And then there is the Iran that does not trust the process at all, that sees every concession as weakness, and every delay as strategic leverage. Those two forces are not aligned. They are competing. And what you are seeing publicly, contradictory statements, mixed signals, sudden reversals, is not confusion. It is the visible result of that internal struggle playing out in real time. Now think about what that means, because if Iran itself is divided, then any external negotiation is already unstable from the beginning. You are not dealing with one strategy, you are dealing with two. And that is exactly why China's silence matters more than it appears. Because once you understand the internal dynamics inside Iran, China's decision to say nothing stops looking passive and starts looking deliberate. And this is where the story begins to shift. Because before China chose to remain silent, it had already made its move. And that move matters more than anything China could say publicly right now. Because China is not a passive actor in this situation. It is one of the most important players shaping the outcome, just not in ways that are immediately visible, not through speeches, not through headlines, but through structure. So if you want to understand China's silence, you have to start by understanding what China has already been doing behind the scenes. There are three layers to this, and each one changes how you should read what is happening right now. First, China has kept Iran economically alive. Even under sustained pressure, Iran's oil exports did not collapse. They continued to flow. In some periods, they even increased. That does not happen inside a system designed to isolate a country. It happens when there is an alternative system operating in parallel, one that bypasses traditional enforcement mechanisms. Indirect shipping routes, ship-to-ship transfers, financial channels that operate outside the Western-dominated system. All of this creates one simple but powerful reality. Iran has oxygen. Not enough to thrive, but enough to survive. Enough to wait, enough to refuse. Now, think about what that means. Because as long as Iran has oxygen, pressure alone cannot force a decision. It can shape behavior, it can delay action, but it cannot determine the outcome. And that changes the entire strategic picture. Second, China has provided diplomatic protection. When pressure escalates at the international level, it rarely reaches its full force. Proposals are blocked, language is softened, enforcement is limited. That is not coincidence, that is design. Because it ensures that Iran is never fully exposed to maximum pressure. There is always a buffer, always a layer of insulation between Iran and the full weight of the system. And that layer creates space, space to calculate, space to delay, space to negotiate on its own terms. Because pressure without full isolation is not absolute pressure. It is conditional pressure. And conditional pressure always leaves room for strategy. Third, and this is where things become decisive, China has already demonstrated that it can intervene when it chooses to. Wang Yi made direct contact with Tehran and pushed for stability in the Strait of Hormuz. And the response was immediate. Iran adjusted, navigation resumed, markets stabilized. For a brief moment, the situation moved toward de-escalation. That tells you something critical. China's influence is not theoretical. It is operational. It can produce results when it decides to act. But now look at what happened next. The pressure did not disappear. The blockade remained. And then a vessel linked to Chinese supply networks heading toward Iran was seized. That event sits at the intersection of everything we just discussed: economic flows, diplomatic protection, strategic leverage. And after that moment, China did not respond. No statement, no escalation, no visible intervention. Now, this is where most interpretations fail, because they assume silence means absence. But in reality, this silence comes after demonstrated capability, which means it is not passive, it is selective. China has already shown that it can influence outcomes when it chooses to. So when it chooses not to act publicly, that decision itself becomes part of the strategy. And that raises a deeper question. What does it cost China to speak? Because if China publicly defends that vessel, it exposes the very system that allows Iran to survive. If it pressures Iran back to the table, it risks taking responsibility for what happens next. And if it pushes too hard toward a deal, it risks losing long-term leverage over Iran entirely. So China calculates: speak and take on cost, or stay silent and keep flexibility. And in this moment, silence is cheaper, safer, more strategic. And that is the key shift you need to see. Because once you understand that silence is a choice, not a default, it stops looking empty. It becomes directional. It becomes something that other actors can read. Because in a system like this, signals are not always spoken. Sometimes they are withheld. And when they are withheld deliberately, they carry even more meaning than words. Which brings us to the next step. Because the real impact of China's silence is not what it says to the world. It is what it signals to Iran. And once you understand how Iran reads that silence, everything about this situation starts to change. Now here is where the story shifts. Because the real impact of China's silence is not what it says to the world. It is what it signals to Iran. And once you look at the situation from Tehran's perspective, that silence starts to carry a very specific meaning. It begins to look like permission. Not explicit permission, not a public endorsement, but something more subtle, structural permission. The kind of permission that does not need to be spoken because it is already built into the system. Think about the sequence again. China has kept Iran economically alive. China has provided diplomatic protection. China has already demonstrated that it can intervene when it chooses to. And then, at a critical moment, Iran refuses to attend negotiations. And China does not object. It does not correct. It does not apply pressure. That sequence matters, because in international politics, actions are rarely interpreted in isolation. They are interpreted in context. And in this context, silence does not mean uncertainty. It means acceptance. From Iran's perspective, the message is clear. Our partner is still buying our oil. Our partner is still shielding us diplomatically. Our partner has not signaled any urgency for us to return to the table. So we can wait. We can refuse. We can hold position. That is what structural permission looks like. It is not a command. It is an environment. An environment in which certain choices become possible without immediate consequence. And that changes behavior. Because once a country believes it has room to maneuver, it starts to use that space. Now consider the alternative. What would it look like if China did not approve of Iran's refusal? It would speak. It would signal urgency. It would push. But none of that is happening. And that absence of pressure is itself the signal. Because pressure is visible, silence is not. And that makes silence more powerful, because it gives freedom without creating accountability. Now take this one step further, because this is where the deeper strategy becomes visible. China does not just want influence over Iran, it wants flexibility. If Iran agrees to a deal, China can support it. If Iran refuses, China can tolerate it. If the situation escalates, China can call for restraint. In every scenario, China remains positioned. But if China speaks too clearly in one direction, it loses that flexibility. It becomes tied to an outcome. And that is exactly what it is trying to avoid. So instead of choosing a side publicly, it creates a structure in which it does not have to. And that is the key. Because in this structure, Iran is free to act, and China is free to adjust. That is not neutrality. That is control without exposure. Now ask yourself, who benefits more from that system? Because while the United States is applying pressure, trying to force a decision, China is shaping the conditions under which that decision is made. One is pushing, the other is positioning. And positioning over time is often more powerful, because it defines the boundaries of what is possible. Now bring this back to Iran, because if Iran believes it has space, it will use it. If it believes there is no immediate cost to refusing, it will refuse. And if it believes its economic lifeline remains intact, it can afford to wait. That is the effect of China's silence. It does not force Iran to act, it allows Iran not to. And that distinction is everything. Because in negotiation, timing is power, and the side that can wait longer often wins. So now the situation looks very different. It is no longer just about whether Iran returns to the table. It is about who controls the timeline. And right now, China's silence is quietly shaping that timeline. Which leads to the next question. Because if silence is giving Iran room to move, what does that mean for the strategy on the other side? And more importantly, what happens when pressure meets a system that is designed not to break? Now, this is where the structure begins to reveal its limits. Because if pressure is being applied consistently, but outcomes are not changing decisively, then something inside the system is absorbing that pressure. And that is exactly what is happening here. From Washington's perspective, the strategy is straightforward. Increase pressure, restrict economic flows, demonstrate military capability, and eventually force a decision. And to a certain extent, that strategy is working. Iran is under strain, its currency is unstable, its economic outlook is uncertain, its internal divisions are becoming more visible. All of that suggests pressure is having an effect. But effect is not the same as outcome, because every time pressure increases, Iran moves, just enough, and then stops. Not because it cannot move further, but because it does not need to. And that is the key problem. Pressure is pushing, but something is setting the limit of how far that push can go. And that limit is not being defined by Iran alone. It is being defined by the system around Iran, a system that still provides economic oxygen, a system that still offers diplomatic cover, a system that prevents pressure from reaching its full intensity. And at the center of that system is China. Now, think about what that means in practical terms. Because as long as Iran can continue exporting oil through alternative channels, it retains a baseline level of stability. Not enough to grow, but enough to endure. As long as Iran is not fully isolated diplomatically, it retains room to maneuver internationally. Not enough to dominate, but enough to negotiate. And as long as those two conditions exist simultaneously, pressure alone cannot force a final decision. It can shape behavior, it can create incentives, but it cannot determine timing. And timing is everything in negotiation. Now, consider how this plays out. The United States increases pressure. Iran responds partially, signals willingness, moves closer to a deal. And then, when the next step requires a deeper commitment, it pauses, it recalculates, it waits, because it knows something critical. It knows that the system sustaining it has not collapsed. And as long as that system remains intact, the cost of waiting is lower than the cost of conceding. That is the ceiling of pressure. Not a visible barrier, not a defined threshold, but a structural limit. A point beyond which pressure cannot go without triggering something larger. Because pushing further would not just affect Iran, it would affect the system supporting Iran. And that system involves actors far beyond the immediate conflict. Now, think about the implications. Because if pressure cannot break the system, then increasing pressure further does not necessarily produce better results. It may simply produce more resistance, more delay, more strategic patience. And that creates a paradox. The harder one side pushes, the more the other side is incentivized to wait. Not indefinitely, but long enough to shift the balance. Now bring China back into the picture, because this is where its silence becomes even more significant. China does not need to counter pressure directly. It only needs to ensure that pressure never becomes absolute. It only needs to maintain the conditions under which Iran can endure. And that is exactly what it is doing, quietly, consistently, without making itself the focus of the conflict. And that is why the current strategy has not produced a decisive outcome, because it is operating inside a system that is designed not to collapse under pressure alone. So now the situation looks very different. It is no longer just about whether pressure works. It is about whether pressure is being applied inside a system that allows it to succeed. And right now, that system is limiting what pressure can achieve, which leads to the next phase of this analysis. Because if pressure is not enough to force a resolution, then the real question becomes, what happens next when the deadline arrives? And more importantly, who benefits if no deal is reached at all? Now, this is where the situation becomes counterintuitive, because when a conflict continues without resolution, the assumption is that everyone is losing. That pressure is building, that costs are rising, that instability is spreading. And while all of that is true on the surface, it does not necessarily mean that every actor is worse off. Because in a system like this, outcomes are not defined only by what is happening, they are defined by who is able to adapt to it. So the real question is not just why the stalemate exists, it is who benefits from it continuing. Start with Iran. At first glance, Iran appears to be under constant pressure: economic strain, political uncertainty, military risk. But look more closely. Iran is still exporting oil, still maintaining internal control, still operating inside a system that allows it to endure. That means it has not been forced into a final decision. It has not been pushed into a corner where only one outcome remains. Instead, it is operating in a space where delay is still an option. And in negotiation, the ability to delay is a form of power, because it allows Iran to wait for better conditions, to test how far pressure can go, to observe how other actors respond over time. So even under pressure, Iran retains agency. Now look at the United States. From Washington's perspective, the goal is clear: apply pressure, force movement, reach a deal on acceptable terms. And again, to a certain extent, this is working. Iran is engaging, negotiations are happening, progress is being made, at least partially. But there is a problem, because without a final resolution, pressure must continue. And the longer it continues, the more resources it consumes. Economic attention, diplomatic capital, strategic focus. All of that is being directed toward maintaining the current level of pressure. And that creates a different kind of cost. Not immediate, but cumulative. Because while one system is being sustained, other priorities are competing for attention. And that matters over time. Now bring China into the picture, because this is where the balance shifts. China is not under the same pressure to resolve the situation quickly. It is not being forced into a deadline. It is not being required to produce an outcome. Instead, it is operating within the existing conditions. And those conditions are not entirely unfavorable. As long as Iran remains partially isolated, it continues to rely on alternative economic channels, channels that China is positioned to benefit from. As long as the conflict remains unresolved, global uncertainty remains elevated. Energy markets fluctuate, supply chains adjust. And in that environment, China can position itself strategically without direct confrontation. It can call for stability publicly, while operating within the instability privately. That dual position is important, because it allows China to maintain influence without taking responsibility for outcomes. And that is where the real advantage emerges. Because if a deal is reached quickly, the system changes. Iran re-enters broader markets, dependencies shift, the balance resets. But if no deal is reached, the current structure remains in place. And in that structure, China is already positioned, already integrated, already benefiting from the existing dynamics. So the stalemate is not simply a failure to resolve the conflict. It is a condition that produces different outcomes for different actors. For some, it is a problem. For others, it is an opportunity. And that is why it persists, because not everyone is equally motivated to end it. Now think about what that means for the next phase. Because if at least one major actor is comfortable with the current situation, then the pressure to resolve it decreases. Not openly, not officially, but structurally. And that changes expectations, because the absence of urgency becomes part of the system itself. Which brings us to the final question. Because if the stalemate continues, and if different actors are benefiting in different ways, then what happens when the deadline actually arrives? And more importantly, what should you be watching to understand what happens next? Now, everything comes down to what happens next. Because when a system reaches this kind of equilibrium, where pressure is being applied but not producing a final outcome, the most important signals are not the statements. They are the small changes in behavior, the shifts that reveal whether the structure is holding or starting to move. So instead of focusing on what is being said publicly, there are three signals you should be watching very carefully. The first signal is China. Not what it says in general terms, but whether it chooses to say anything specific. Because there is a difference between calling for stability and addressing a concrete event. If China remains silent on specific incidents, like the seizure of a vessel linked to its supply network, then that silence is continuing. And that tells you something important. It tells you that China still believes the current structure serves its interests better than changing it. But if China suddenly shifts and begins addressing specific events directly, that is not just a statement. That is a recalibration, a sign that the cost of silence may be rising. The second signal is direct engagement. Watch for whether Wang Yi re-engages at a high level, because we have already seen what happens when that occurs. When China applies targeted pressure, Iran responds. So if that channel activates again, it suggests that China is no longer comfortable with the current trajectory, that it is beginning to see risk where previously it saw opportunity. But if that channel remains quiet, then the message is equally clear. The current balance is acceptable. The third signal is Iran itself, not what is announced, but what is actually done, because there is a gap between public positioning and real decision-making. If Iran sends a delegation, even after signaling refusal, that tells you that the internal balance has shifted toward negotiation. But if it does not move, if it holds position, then the opposite is true. The faction that prefers delay is winning, and that matters. Because inside Iran, there is not one strategy. There are competing ones, and whichever one dominates will determine the next phase. Now step back and look at all three signals together: China's silence, China's engagement, Iran's actual movement. Because the interaction between those three elements will define what happens next. Not any single announcement, not any single headline, but the pattern they form over time. And that brings us to the final point. Because if you have followed this entire structure, you can see something that is not being said directly anywhere. This situation is not being controlled by one side. It is being shaped by a system in which pressure is applied, resistance is maintained, and stability is managed indirectly. And within that system, not every actor is trying to end the conflict as quickly as possible. Some are trying to shape it, to extend it, to benefit from it, which leads to the real conclusion. The most powerful move in this entire situation was not a statement. It was not a military action. It was not a negotiation. It was a decision to remain silent, because that silence allowed everything else to continue exactly as it is. And in doing so, it shaped the outcome without ever appearing to control it. That is the real strategy. Now the question is, do you think China is avoiding responsibility or quietly controlling the direction of this conflict? Let me know what you think in the comments.